The sound of a sneer is hard to hear, but easy to feel. He looked at her simple name tag, then down at her comfortable, worn-out work shoes, and let out a noise of pure disgust. It was barely audible over the delicate clinking of silver forks against fine china, but it was loud enough to freeze the air in their immediate corner of the room. The restaurant was a massive, cavernous space filled with dark wood and velvet, located on the 42nd floor of the city's most expensive skyscraper. It was a place designed to make regular people feel small, but Kongdae took up space like a man who owned the oxygen in the room. He sat with his legs wide apart, one polished dress shoe tapping a fast, irritated rhythm against the table leg. He looked like a predator twitching its tail before a pounce. Kongdae was not just a difficult customer. He was a powerful Korean mafia boss, and he wore his authority like armor. He was dressed in a sharp, intimidating black mafia suit with a crisp white collared shirt that seemed to glow under the dim lights. Across from him sat his fiancée, Hannah. She stared intensely at the white tablecloth, twisting a diamond engagement ring that looked heavy enough to sink a small fishing boat. Her posture was a silent apology for the scene everyone knew was coming. Standing at the edge of their table was Sarah. She kept her hands clasped behind her back straight, and her eyes fixed on a point just above the mafia boss's left shoulder. This was how she had been trained in fine dining, never challenged the dominant male directly. Sarah was an African-American woman who carried a bone-deep exhaustion. It wasn't just from the double shift she was working, it was the fatigue of being overqualified and invisible. She had a doctorate in East Asian linguistics that was currently collecting dust in a drawer while she navigated the whims of men who thought a heavy credit card gave them the right to treat people like furniture. The air conditioning in the restaurant was cold, yet a bead of sweat began to form at the nape of her neck. It was a physical reaction to the heavy, dark energy radiating from the man in the bespoke black suit. Kongdae picked up the heavy leather menu, held it for a second as if weighing its value, and then let it drop onto the table with a loud, dismissive thud. 3 diners at nearby tables flinched. He didn't look at the food. He looked at Sarah, his eyes narrowing with a mix of boredom and cruelty, scanning her face for a crack, a sign of weakness he could use for entertainment. The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah knew this type of man well. In her 6 months working at this high-end establishment, she had categorized the rich bullies. There were the loud ones who wanted everyone to know they had money, the touchy ones who didn't respect personal space, and then there was this type, the quiet sadist. This was the man who lowered his voice so you had to lean in, forcing you to bow before he even spoke a word. The mafia boss adjusted his cuffs and finally spoke, though he didn't look at her. He spoke to the air, as if she were a broken toaster that couldn't possibly understand human speech. "This table," he said, his English perfect but spoken with a slow, deliberate tone that insulted her intelligence, "is unstable. It wobbles." It didn't wobble. Sarah knew it didn't wobble because she had checked it herself 10 minutes ago, sliding a small coaster under the leg to correct a tiny gap in the floorboards. But the truth didn't matter to a man like Kongdae. Reality was whatever the mafia boss decided it was. "I apologize, sir," Sarah said, her voice steady. It was a practiced tone that hid the frustration burning in her chest. "Allow me to adjust that for you immediately." She crouched down, her knees popping slightly, a sound that felt humiliatingly loud in the quiet restaurant. She pretended to inspect the perfectly stable table leg, fully aware that he was watching the top of her head with a look of supreme distaste. From down there, she saw Hannah reach out and gently touch the mafia boss's wrist, a silent plea for him to be nice. He shook her off with a sharp, violent jerk of his arm. It was a small gesture that told Sarah everything she needed to know about their relationship. Rising from the floor, Sarah adjusted her apron and met his gaze again. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, but her mind was sharpening its defenses. She had spent the last 5 years studying the complicated dance of polite speech, grammar, and cultural signals in East Asian hierarchies. She had intended to use that knowledge for diplomacy or translation, not for handling the ego of a crime lord playing emperor in a steakhouse. But student loans were expensive and the job market was tough, so here she was, serving beef to a man who looked at her as if she were dirt on his shoe. Mr. Pringle, the floor manager, was hovering near the entrance. His face was pale and sweaty. He watched the interaction with the terrified intensity of a man who knew his bonus depended on the mood of the VIP in Section 4. Mr. Pringle was a man with no backbone, a corporate weather vane who turned whichever way the money blew. Sarah knew that if the Mafia boss decided to make a scene, Pringle would throw her to the wolves without a second thought. Kongdae seemed to sense the manager's fear from across the room and drew energy from it. His smile widened, revealing teeth that looked too white, too straight. "I don't want the menu," the Mafia boss said, waving a hand at the leather book as if it were dirty. "The chef knows who I am. Tell him I want the usual, but the way I had it back home in the southern province. Not the watered-down garbage he serves to the tourists here." He paused, waiting for Sarah to stumble, to ask for clarification, to show the ignorance he assumed she possessed. "And bring a bottle of the '82 vintage red wine. If you break the cork, I'm charging it to your personal account." It was a ridiculous threat. The bottle cost more than she made in 6 months, but it was designed to make her hands shake, to ensure the failure he predicted would happen. The atmosphere at the table shifted from tense to toxic. The Mafia boss leaned back in his black suit, bored with the appetizer round of humiliation and ready for the main course. He turned his attention to his fiancée, who was staring into her water glass. "Look at her," Kongdae said, gesturing towards Sarah with a flick of his chin. He was speaking now in rapid-fire, casual language, his native tongue. He spoke with the ease of a native speaker, assuming the African-American waitress standing 3 feet away heard only noise. Stiff as a board. "You think she even knows what that wine is?" "She probably thinks it's a type of grape soda." Hannah flinched, her eyes darting up to Sarah's face in panic, checking to see if the insult had landed. But Sarah remained stone-faced, her eyes focused on the notepad in her hand. The assumption that she couldn't understand was a common arrogance among the international elite who came here. They treated the staff like background characters in a movie, lacking the brains to process anything beyond a dinner order. But Sarah's heart was hammering against her ribs. She understood every word. She understood the specific regional accent he was using, the tough guy dialect he was faking to sound more dangerous and authentic, hiding his likely city upbringing. She understood the derogatory term he had just used for her, a word that targeted her race with a casual sneer that made her blood run cold. But she didn't react. Not yet. To react now would be to lose the war before the first battle was truly fought. She wrote down the wine order, her handwriting elegant and steady, and waited. She let him dig the hole deeper, letting him believe he was safe behind the wall of his language. Kongdae, disappointed by her lack of confusion, decided to escalate. He leaned forward, his white shirt straining slightly against the black suit jacket, invading her personal space. "Actually," he said, switching back to English, his voice dripping with fake helpfulness, "forget the chef's choice. I want to order something specific. Something complex." He smirked at Hannah, who looked like she might be sick. "Let's see if the service here lives up to the prices." He turned his cold eyes back to Sarah. "I will tell you what I want," he said. Then, without a pause, without a transition, he launched into a complex, high-speed monologue in his native language. He wasn't just ordering food, he was building a maze. He described a specific preparation of raw beef, detailing the exact thickness of the cut, the ratio of sesame oil to pear juice, the precise temperature of the serving plate, and the exclusion of pine nuts due to a preference he wove in biting commentary about how the kitchen would inevitably ruin it. He spoke about the side dishes, demanding a specific seasoned root vegetable but prepared with a level of fermentation that took days, an impossible request for an immediate order, designed solely to force her to say, "I don't understand." He threw in slang terms for incompetence and ended the tirade with a rude remark about her appearance, laughing as he said it, looking to Hannah for validation. The restaurant had gone quiet around them. The sheer volume and aggression of his speech acted as a spotlight. Mr. Pringle was walking toward the table now, wringing his hands, ready to intervene, ready to pull Sarah away and offer a groveling apology for whatever offense she hadn't committed. The Mafia boss stopped speaking and looked up at Sarah, a triumphant grin on his face. He looked like a man who had just won a game against an opponent who didn't even know they were playing. "Well?" he asked in English, his voice booming slightly. "Did you get all that? Or is it too much for you to process?" He leaned back, crossing his arms over his black suit, waiting for the stammer, the confusion, the inevitable crumbling of the help. Sarah looked at him, then at the terrified fiancé, and finally at the approaching manager. She closed her notepad with a soft, deliberate snap. The sound was small, but in the silence the Mafia boss had created, it sounded like a judge slamming a gavel. Sarah cleared her throat. It wasn't a nervous sound. It was the sound of someone preparing to speak with authority. When she spoke, the English that had defined her existence in this room disappeared. She was replaced instantly by a flawless, crystalline version of his own language. She didn't just mimic it, she inhabited it with a scholar's precision. She didn't use the rough, street-level gangster dialect the Mafia boss had used to sound intimidating. Instead, she adopted the highest register of formal, royal court-style speech, a style reserved for addressing elders, dignitaries, or, in this specific context, used ironically to highlight the profound lack of class of the person being addressed. "Sir," she began, her eyes locking onto his with a terrifying calmness, regarding the raw beef preparation. "The kitchen can certainly accommodate the ratio of oil to juice you requested. However, I must inform you that the seasoned root vegetable you desire requires a 48-hour fermentation period to achieve the specific acidity you described." She paused, allowing the sentence to hang in the air like a blade. She watched the color drain from the Mafia boss's face as his brain struggled to process what was happening. To serve it today would result in a bitter taste that would insult a palate as sophisticated as yours. As for the pine nuts, we will omit them as per your preference. She shifted her weight slightly, turning her gaze briefly to Hannah, offering a subtle nod of solidarity before returning to the man in the black Mafia suit who was now gripping the table edge. "And concerning the vintage wine, sir, I assure you I am quite familiar with it. It is known for its notes of blackcurrant and truffle, not soda. I will open it with the utmost care to ensure no sediment disturbs your experience. Would you like to verify the bottle's history before I open it, or shall I trust your judgment?" The silence that fell upon the table was absolute. It was a vacuum where sound simply ceased to exist. It was more profound and suffocating than the quiet the Mafia boss had commanded earlier. This was not the silence of submission, it was the silence of a magic trick revealed. Mr. Pringle, who had been 3 steps away and bracing himself to apologize, froze in mid-stride. His mouth hung slightly open, looking back and forth between the waitress and the customer like a spectator at a tennis match where the ball had suddenly turned into a bird. Congde's mouth worked silently for a moment. His arrogant smirk fell apart, replaced by a look of shock and embarrassment. The power dynamic of the table had been flipped so violently that he seemed physically dizzy. His eyes darted around the room to see who else had witnessed his defeat. Sarah hadn't just understood him. She had corrected him. She had taken his complex, impossible order, designed as a trap, and dismantled it with logic, all while speaking a version of his own language that was more refined, more elegant, and more grammatically perfect than his own. The tough guy act crumbled instantly against the wall of her academic knowledge. By using the ultra-polite language, she had trapped him. He couldn't get angry without looking like a barbarian screaming at a diplomat. She had weaponized politeness, wrapping her defiance in a velvet glove that left him no room to move without exposing his own stupidity. The Mafia boss's recovery was messy. His face flushed a deep red, the anger of a narcissist who's been laughed at by the universe bubbling up. He couldn't attack her for being rude because she had been the definition of polite. He couldn't attack her for incompetence because she had demonstrated superior knowledge. So, he attacked the situation itself. "You," he stammered, his English returning in a clumsy rush, then switching back to his native tongue, but this time his voice lacked the swagger. It sounded shrill and offensive. "Who are you? Why didn't you say you spoke the language? You were listening? You were spying on us." He slammed his hand on the table, the silverware jumping. "Is this how this place operates? Spies disguised as waiters." The accusation was weak and desperate, and everyone knew it. Hannah, for the first time all night, lifted her head. She looked at Sarah, then at her fiancé, and a strange expression crossed her face. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a sudden realization. She was seeing the man she was with through a new lens. She covered her mouth with a napkin to hide a cough, but Sarah caught the sparkle in her eyes. She was hiding a smile. The fear that had radiated from her earlier was evaporating, replaced by the thrill of seeing the bully get bullied. Mr. Pringle, finally recovering his ability to move, stepped into the mess. His instinct to please the wealthy patron was warring with his confusion. "Sir, is there a problem? Has Sarah offended you?" he asked, his voice trembling. He was ready to throw Sarah under the bus if it meant saving the check. Sarah didn't look at the manager. She kept her eyes on the Mafia boss, refusing to let him look away. "I was not spying, sir," she said in English now, for the benefit of the manager and the surrounding tables that had gone quiet to listen. "I was waiting for your order. You chose to give it in a language you assumed I did not speak, to test the service. I simply passed the test." Her voice was calm and reasonable, making his outrage look hysterical by comparison. "I have a PhD in East Asian linguistics with a focus on regional dialects. I recognized your accent immediately. It is quite distinctive." The mention of the degree was the final blow. It changed her entire existence in his eyes. She wasn't a servant. She was an overqualified intellectual trapped in a service economy. She was a peer, or perhaps a superior, wearing an apron. The shame of it burned him. He had treated a scholar like a dog. The diners at the adjacent tables, who had previously ignored the scene, were now fully engaged, whispering behind their hands. Kong Dae could feel their judgment. He was losing the room. He was losing face, the one thing he couldn't buy with his black credit card. He looked at the menu, then at Sarah, then at Mr. Pringle. "I want her fired," the Mafia boss hissed, his voice dropping to a poisonous whisper. "Get her out of my sight. Now. Or I buy this building and fire you all." It was a childish threat, the tantrum of a man with no moves left. But in the cowardly world of high-end hospitality, it was a nuclear option that often worked. Mr. Pringle went pale. His eyes shifted to Sarah with a look of pleading apology. He was about to fold. He was opening his mouth to say the words that would end her shift and possibly her employment, sacrificing a good employee for a bad customer's money. But the room had one more card to play. From the booth directly behind the Mafia boss, a semi-private corner reserved for the restaurant's most discreet and powerful guests, a figure stood up. It was an older man with silver hair, wearing a suit that cost more than Kong Dae's car. He held a glass of red wine with a casual, relaxed grip. He had been dining alone, his presence so quiet that he had blended into the woodwork. He turned, not to the manager, but to the Mafia boss. "That won't be necessary," the older man said. He spoke in their shared language, but his dialect was the crisp, authoritative standard of the political elite. It was a voice that carried the weight of boardrooms and government ministries. "I have been listening to this young woman. Her use of the language is impeccable. Better, I might add, than yours." He stepped closer, the light catching a small pin on his lapel that Sarah recognized immediately. It was the insignia of one of the massive conglomerates that effectively ran the economy of their home country. Kong Dae recognized it too. He shrank back into his chair, his aggressive posture collapsing into the slump of a schoolboy caught smoking. "Chairman Park," the Mafia boss whispered. The color drained from his face for the second time that night, leaving him gray. This wasn't a rival gangster. This was the establishment. This was the money behind the money. I didn't see you there." The chairman ignored the apology. He turned his gaze to Sarah. "Young lady," he said in flawless English, "your understanding of the fermentation process for the root vegetable is correct, and your restraint in the face of this behavior is commendable." He turned to Mr. Pringle. "If you fire her, manager, you will lose my business, and the business of everyone I know. Do we understand each other?" Mr. Pringle looked like he was about to faint from relief. The math had changed instantly. The bigger fish had spoken. "Of course, Chairman Park. Of course not. Sarah is our best. Our finest," he trailed off, breathless. The chairman turned back to the Mafia boss, his face hard. "You are embarrassing yourself," he said, his voice low and cutting. "And you are embarrassing our culture. Finish your meal in silence or leave." The command was absolute. There was no room for negotiation. Kong Dae looked at the table, his hands trembling with suppressed rage and humiliation. He had been stripped of his status, his weapon, and his dignity in the span of 5 minutes. He looked at Hannah, hoping for an ally, but she was looking at the menu, a small, secret smile playing on her lips. She wasn't afraid anymore. She picked up the wine list and looked at Sarah. I think, Hannah said, her voice clear and light, speaking English with a confidence she hadn't shown all night. I would like to try that vintage wine, if you recommend it. Sarah smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached her eyes. An excellent choice, ma'am. I'll bring the wine specialist to open it for you right away. She stepped back, giving a small bow to Chairman Park, who nodded once in acknowledgement, and then turned to walk toward the service station. Her legs felt heavy as the adrenaline began to fade, but her head was high. She could feel the eyes of the room on her back, but they didn't feel like weights anymore. They felt like spotlights on a victor. The rest of the service passed in a blur of surreal calm. The Mafia boss and his fiancée ate quickly. The dynamic at their table forever changed. Kongdae barely spoke, eating mechanically, his eyes fixed on his plate. Hannah, however, engaged the staff with polite nods and quiet requests, tasting the freedom that comes from seeing your captor diminished. When the check came, the Mafia boss threw a card down without looking, desperate to escape the scene of his execution. As they stood to leave, Hannah lingered for a second. She caught Sarah's eye across the floor. She didn't wave, but she touched her hand to her heart briefly, a universal gesture of gratitude that transcended language barriers. Sarah nodded back. Mr. Pringle was waiting by the computer terminal, looking at Sarah with a mixture of awe and fear. He knew he had almost made a mistake that would have cost him his career, and he knew Sarah knew it. Good work tonight, Sarah, he said, his voice struggling for authority and failing. That was handled well. Sarah didn't let him off the hook with a smile. She just looked at him, her face calm. I did my job, Mr. Pringle, she said, punching her code into the computer. Next time, I hope the house supports me before a customer has to. She walked away before he could respond, untying her apron as she headed for the locker room. The kitchen staff, who had heard the story through the grapevine, gave her silent nods of respect as she passed. She wasn't just the quiet girl with a PhD anymore. She was the one who had stared down a dragon and made him blink. 3 years later, the memory of the restaurant felt like a scene from a movie Sarah had watched a long time ago, vivid but distant. The massive glass windows of her current office overlooked the United Nations Plaza. The flags of 100 nations were snapping in the autumn wind. The nameplate on her desk read Dr. Sarah Williams, Senior Liaison, Bureau of Diplomatic Affairs. The office was quiet, filled with the smell of old paper and fresh coffee. It was a sanctuary of competence. She was reviewing a transcript for an upcoming trade summit when her phone buzzed with a news alert. She usually ignored them during work hours, but the headline caught her eye. It was a report on a corruption scandal involving mid-level crime syndicates and construction fraud. The photo accompanying the article showed a familiar face, Kongdae. He looked older, tired, and was flanked by police officers. His face was hidden from the cameras by a jacket pulled over his head. He had lost the game. He thought he was winning. Sarah looked at the photo for a long moment. She felt no joy, but she felt a quiet, settled validation. She thought of the scuffed shoes she had worn that night, the ache in her feet, and the way he had looked at her name tag, as if it were a price tag on a clearance item. She swiped the notification away and turned back to her work. The text in front of her was complex and nuanced, requiring a mastery of language that few possessed. She picked up her pen,